Welcome to Privacy News Today. This segment is presented to you by Termageddon.com. We're a website policies generator that has successfully generated tens of thousands of privacy policies and kept them up to date with changing legislation. I wanted to note that any information that we talk about today is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal advice. So for today's privacy news, we'll be talking about the Connecticut Attorney General releasing their privacy law report. So Connecticut SB 6, also known as the Connecticut Data Privacy Act, was passed on May 11th, 2022, and it went into effect on July 1st, 2023. If you're a Termageddon customer, just know that your privacy policy has already been updated for this law if it does apply to you. So who does the law apply to? So it applies to anyone that does business in Connecticut or that provides goods or services that are targeted towards residents of the state, and that during the previous year, if they controlled or processed the personal data of 100,000 or more Connecticut residents, or they controlled or processed the personal data of 25,000 or more residents of the state and derived more than 25% of their gross revenue from the sale of personal data. I also wanted to note that while the law generally applies to larger businesses only because of these constraints, it can also apply to small businesses if one of your clients is processing data that's this amount of data, and they use you as a vendor for processing that data as well. So for example, if you help your clients send email newsletters or anything like that, and they need to comply with this law, they may ask you to comply with this law by contract as well. So if you don't meet this criteria above here, the best option is to check your contracts as well, just to make sure that none of your clients required you to comply by contract too. Now, the purpose of the law is to provide privacy rights to residents of Connecticut. So residents of Connecticut can access the data that you've collected about them. So for example, you may need to send them a CSV file of all the data you've collected about them. To correct inaccuracies in their data. So for example, if their email is incorrect or their name is incorrect in your records, they may ask you to correct it. To delete their data, and then also to opt out of sales of their data, opt out of targeted ads, or opt out of profiling. And businesses have certain obligations under this law too. So they need to minimize data collection, meaning that they only need to collect the data that they actually need. So you can't just collect data with no purpose. You would also need to provide a privacy policy that includes all of the disclosures required by that law. You're required to keep data secure, and then also obtain consent prior to selling the data of teens, and then conduct data protection assessments for different uses of data that may present a heightened risk to the consumer. Now, the Attorney General of Connecticut has released a report of all the things that they've done prior to or since the effective date of this law. So first, since the passage of the law, they updated their website, and now it includes a consumer complaint portal where individuals can file complaints when companies have violated their privacy rights. So far, the office has received more than 30 consumer complaints about violations that they have investigated. And they've also undertaken several different enforcement actions, and they helpfully broke it down into different categories. So enforcement actions so far have concerned privacy policies, the processing of sensitive data, the processing of data of teenagers and children, as well as processing data by data brokers, which are companies that sell and buy personal data. Now, so far, the Attorney General's office has sent 10 violation notices to companies, specifically regarding privacy policy violations. And the complaints coming from consumers, those included privacy policy issues as well. So violations regarding to privacy policies included failure to provide the required disclosures. So Connecticut's privacy law has very specific disclosures that it requires privacy policies to make. So some companies do not include all of those disclosures within their privacy policy. Failure to provide adequate disclosures, meaning that the disclosures were provided, but they didn't provide consumers with enough information. So for example, if your privacy policy says that you share personal data with partners and third parties, that's really not enough information for a consumer to be able to decide, who their data is actually being shared with. So that's a great example. Providing confusing disclosures, meaning that the disclosures provided weren't overly clear and consumers weren't able to understand what the disclosures mean. Failure to provide instructions enabling consumers to opt out of sales of their data or opt out of targeted ads. Burdensome rights mechanisms. So that basically means that it would be extremely burdensome for a consumer to exercise their privacy rights. Great example is, let's say a consumer is interacting with your business, specifically just online, but you require them to send you a physical letter to exercise their right to opt out of sales of data. That's burdensome, meaning that consumers should be able to exercise their rights online if that's how they interact with your business. And then also broken or inactive rights mechanisms. So for example, some businesses may have a link to a page to allow consumers to opt out of sales of their data within their privacy policy, but that link is broken or led to like a 404 error page, so consumers weren't actually able to exercise their rights. So these are just examples of what to look out for in your privacy policy if you do need to comply with this law, because these types of issues will probably gain further enforcement or may even cause the issuance of fines. So that's the Connecticut's Attorney General's report on their new privacy law and what has been happening since the effective date of that law.